Have you ever wondered how atoms join together to form compounds? Like, how does something reactive like sodium combine with chlorine to make table salt? Well, that all comes down to ionic bonding. In this video, I'm going to explain what ionic bonding is, how it happens, and why it works. So first, what even is ionic bonding? Well, ionic bonding is the attraction between positive and negative ions. This happens when one atom loses the electron and another atom gains that electron. Because electrons are transferred, the atoms become charged. And those opposite charges attract each other. And if you know your basics, positive and negatives attract each other. Positive, positive, negative, negative. They repel. So, in simple terms, ionic bonding is electron transfer plus attraction between opposite charges. But why do atoms even do this? Well, atoms form bonds because they want to become more stable. A lot of atoms become stable when their outer electron shell is full. This is sometimes called having a full valence shell. So, some atoms can become stable by losing electrons, and other atoms can become stable by gaining electrons. This is exactly what happens in ionic bonding. Let's take a look at this classic example of sodium and chlorine. Sodium has 1 electron in its outer shell, and chlorine has 7 in its outer electron shell. Sodium would be more stable if it lost 1 electron, and chlorine would be more stable if it gained 1 electron. So sodium transfers its 1 outer electron to chlorine. So now this changes both atoms into ions. It's because sodium loses 1 electron, it becomes a positive ion, written as Na positive. Chlorine gains 1 electron, so it becomes a negative ion, written as chlorine negative. And since positive and negative charges attract, those two ions are pulled together, and that attraction is called an ionic bond. And together they form sodium chloride, or table salt. But just what are ions? Well, an ion is just an atom that has gained or lost electrons. If an atom loses that electron, it has more protons than electrons, so it becomes positive. If an atom gains that electron, it has more electrons than protons, so it becomes negative. So, a positive ion is a cation, and I believe sorry, I have to double check my pronunciation, but a negative ion is an anion. Anion? Yeah. Anyways, you don't really have to memorize the fancy words straight away, but it's really good to know them. But ionic bonding usually happens between a metal and a non-metal. That's because metals tend to lose electrons and non-metals tend to gain electrons. So metals usually form positive ions and non-metals usually form negative ions. That makes ionic bonding very common between those two groups. For example, sodium and chlorine, magnesium and oxygen, and calcium and fluorine. Now let's take a look at another example. Let's take magnesium and oxygen. You are not supposed to see this yet. Sorry. So magnesium has 2 electrons in its outer shell, so it wants to lose 2. And oxygen has 6 electrons in its outer shell, so it wants to gain 2. Magnesium transfers those 2 electrons to oxygen, so magnesium becomes magnesium 2 plus, and oxygen becomes oxygen 2 minus, 2 negative. These opposite ions attract each other and form magnesium oxide. So this is the same idea, but just with 2 electrons instead of 1. Ionic compounds have some important properties. They usually have high melting and boiling points. They form crystal lattice structures, which effectively they look like this. I'm so bad at drawing this. Ding, 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 ding. They're often soluble in water and conduct electricity when melted or dissolved, but not when solid. Why? Well, because the ions are held together by strong electrostatic forces of attraction. That means it takes a lot of energy to break them apart. And when the ions are free to move, like in molten or dissolved forms, they carry electrical charges. An important idea is the lattice structure. One thing to know is that ionic compounds don't just form one tiny pair of ions and stop there. They form this giant lattice structure. That means there's a repeating pattern of positive and negative ions all the way through the substance. So in something like sodium chloride, it's not just Na positive stuck to one chlorine negative. It's a huge structure made of many ions bonded together. So, to quickly sum it up, ionic bonding happens when electrons are transferred. And when electrons are transferred, one atom becomes a positive ion and one atom becomes a negative. And those opposite charges attract. This usually happens between a metal and a nonmetal. And a classic example is sodium and chlorine, which form sodium chloride. So, ionic bonding is basically all about atoms becoming more stable and transferring electrons. That transfer creates oppositely charged ions, and those ions attract each other strongly. Once you understand that, ionic bonding becomes much easier to recognize and explain.